Hi, hello, and welcome. I'm so excited to welcome everyone today to Alta Live. Today, we are going to discuss the past, present, and future of San Francisco's city cemetery with historian Woody LaBounty and Alta Journal contributor Beth Winegarner. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor. So here's today's topic. San Francisco's Legion of Honor Museum and the Lincoln Park Golf Course sit atop the grave sites of thousands of immigrants and indigenous people. Their stories and some of their remains are coming to the surface. In issue 21 of Alta Journal, Beth, one of our guests today, digs in to the storied corner of San Francisco. She and historian Woody LaBounty join us today for what I hope will be an engrossing discussion about the city's curious history of cemeteries and what might happen to the human remains still hidden beneath San Francisco's surface. There's also been a little bit of a status update with the cemetery since the publication of Beth's article, and we're going to talk about that as well. Briefly about our guests, Woody LaBounty is a San Francisco researcher, author, and presenter on local history, the former executive director of the Western Neighborhoods Project and vice president of advocacy and programs at San Francisco Heritage. He writes weekly about the city's past at San Francisco Story. Beth Winegarner is a journalist, author, essayist, and member of our beloved San Francisco Writers Grotto. You may have seen her bylines in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Guardian, the Washington Post, Wired, Mother Jones, and Alta. She is a former daily news reporter for the San Francisco Examiner and a former contrib to the Chronicle. Before we dive in, thank you everyone for letting us know where you're zooming in from today. It is very cool. We're gonna give you all shout outs. Hi, Mark from Cupertino. Brief housekeeping. Alta Live is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. If you are unfamiliar with Alta, we are an award-winning quarterly magazine and website focused on California and the West. You can join us as a member for as little as $3 a month and support the work we do, including this gorgeous magazine. Here's Beth's article. We're big and bold. As well as our monthly California book club, which is free and very fun to join. We also present weekly events like this one today. We're actually running a special right now. If you purchase our annual membership for $50, you will not only get a year of Alta, but you will get this. Oh, I can't believe I'm doing this. This California Book Club baseball cap, which is very cool. It's a $35 value. We will send you this in addition to Alta. So there you go. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. You can ask questions of Beth or Woody. We will chat for about 30 minutes and get to as many of those questions as we can. Don't worry, this will all be recorded and posted to altaonline.com. We're going to send you an email with links to all of that. Woody's even got a upcoming walk through a former graveyard. He's going to give a tour on October 22nd. We'll give you a link to that as well. So stay tuned for your email. Check your email later this afternoon. Okay, it's so great to see where everyone is zooming in from today. Massachusetts, Point Reyes, Novato. I am also in Novato. Woody, where are you today?
San Francisco, greatest city in the world.
And Beth, what about you?
Glen Park, which was once south of San Francisco.
Well, welcome. It's so great to have you both here. Woody, we're going to start with you. I'm going to give you the historian's role. Can you give us a brief overview of how the city of San Francisco, before its official formation and since, has handled its dead?
Sure, we can do that really quick. If you die today in San Francisco, you're most likely going to be buried in Colma, which is a vast necropolis town down the peninsula outside of San Francisco. But in the early days, when San Francisco started at the gold rush, people were buried pretty much wherever there was some outlying ground, on the side of Russian Hill, on the side of Telegraph Hill. Most of the port of San Francisco, the people who lived there were all centered around what is the financial district today. So you didn't have to go far to find a place to bury somebody. And there were a lot of people dying during the gold rush. They came here sick, they got sick during the unsanitary situation that was happening in this giant boom town going on. So they had to bury a lot of dead very quickly. San Francisco itself decided they had to get more organized, and they created a municipal cemetery called Yerba Buena Cemetery on a 13-acre plot that was a triangle where Market Street and McAllister is today, essentially right where the Civic Center is. That was San Francisco's first municipal cemetery. So this was about a mile outside of town when they founded it in 1850, and they said, hey, problem solved. We've got 13 acres, it's outside of town, no problems. 4 years later, they were like, cemetery's full. Town kind of grew up around it. There was Hayes Valley. Suddenly everybody was like, we don't want a cemetery here. And the city leaders quickly agreed and decided to halt burials in 1854 at Yerba Buena Cemetery after tens of thousands of people had been buried there. So where are you going to get buried now? 1854, they closed the cemetery. There are 4 private cemeteries that got established in the 1850s and 1860s, way out of town, they thought. And that was around Lone Mountain, which is today where USF is. If you're going to Trader Joe's or the Target up there, that's the area that these 4 cemeteries were crowded around. There was a Laurel Hill Cemetery, which was a private cemetery. Presbyterians, senators, capitalists got buried there mostly. Calvary Cemetery, which was the Roman Catholic cemetery. Masonic Cemetery, run by the Masons, and the Oddfellows Cemetery. So those were called the Big Four, and they were around Lone Mountain, and were established in the 1850s and 1860s, and that's where everybody was buried. They also thought it would take quite a while for the city to catch up to that area, and it was good to keep it out of town. Spoiler alert, city quickly passed that really fast. The Western Addition was put in the 1850s, mid 1850s, and suddenly now we have the Richmond district on the far side. So that was essentially how we dealt with things. We basically tried to find a burial ground farther away from the population because every square meter of San Francisco is incredibly valuable. And somebody always wants to make money or build something on it or do something with it. So finally, the city decided they got a lot more land from the federal government, essentially in the 1860s, that went all the way to Ocean Beach. And then they said, okay, we're going to take care of this problem. We're going to create a 200-acre municipal cemetery way out, where today's Legion of Honor is today. And that would be the new municipal cemetery, again, thought to be way out of town. And it was, the first burials were done there in 1870. And that's what we'll talk about later, about Lincoln Park and what was called the City Cemetery. I'll do a quick update of why these cemeteries aren't here, and then I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
Great.
Essentially, San Francisco decided it didn't want any new burials in the city limits and banned them in 1900 all through the city. Cemeteries were closed. They eventually started getting more decrepit because they lost their revenue generating model, which was new burials. And eventually the city said, you know, now you have to remove all the bodies and move them all out of town altogether. They closed and condemned the Big Four cemeteries and City Cemetery. And whether they moved all the bodies and how many of the bodies they moved is a subject that is up to debate, and researchers are still trying to get the numbers. But that's why we don't have cemeteries in San Francisco now, except for 2 smaller ones, one in the Presidio and one at Mission Dolores.
And the columbarium, which is—
That's true. If you want to be interred in San Francisco because you love this place, getting a niche in the columbarium is a good option. Former Oddfellows Cemetery.
Beth, when did you first become interested in what I guess is the City Cemetery, San Francisco City Cemetery, now the Lincoln Park Golf Course and Legion of Honor? How did you find out that there are literally thousands of skeletons beneath that?
Well, the common wisdom in San Francisco is that we don't have cemeteries anymore, that everybody's buried in Colma. And I was attending a talk last summer, on corpse roads in Britain, which are these pathways that were used basically only to convey the coffin of the dead from their home to the churchyard for burial. And there's all these folklore and superstitions and like things you do to make sure that the spirit of the dead doesn't come back home along the same pathway. And I just got very curious, like, what were the pathways in San Francisco that went to the cemeteries? And with the help of another local historian, Elizabeth Creeley, I discovered digital newspaper archives, and I just started reading article after article. And it started out like, what were the roads to the cemeteries? But then it very quickly became what Woody was talking about. Here was a cemetery. Maybe it, closed and then moved, or maybe there are bodies still there. And then 20 years later, there'd be an article like, people were digging to build something new and bodies were found, and they didn't even realize that there had been a cemetery there before. And it just happened over and over and over again.
Woody, can you tell us a little bit about why the bones that remain beneath or within the city cemetery, or what was once the city cemetery, tend to be those of either indigenous people, immigrants, impoverished people? I understood from Beth's article, a number of them had taken their lives and thus were not welcome in other cemeteries. Can you talk a little bit about just kind of the demographics, as it were?
Yes. So the city cemetery at Lincoln Park was the municipal cemetery. So if you died in San Francisco and you had no friends or family who could take care of your funeral arrangements, you were essentially going to be buried on the county dime, right? You're the indigent dead. You were put in at city cemetery and the city paid for it. So most, well, I would say most, we could say a majority of the people who were buried at city cemetery were in this category. They were buried by the county of San Francisco because they were poor, because I think of them as like the people who actually built San Francisco. We often talk of these capitalists or people in power or government officials who built San Francisco, but these are the people who literally built it on their backs. They're working people, they're laborers, they're living on the edge, on the margins, but they're the people who actually did the hard work of building San Francisco. So the problem is they have no money, they have no standing, you might say, in the power structure. So they're very easily forgotten, and they're very easily ignored when we talk about like respecting our dead or about moving these bodies. So most of the people who are still there at City Cemetery fall in this category. The other groups that you would find there are these immigrant communities that either couldn't get a place to have their own burial grounds in the private cemeteries, or didn't have the funds or the means to actually purchase or have a burial ground reserved for them. So the city would grant these burial grounds in city cemetery to these communities. And there were fraternal organizations and other sort of benevolent societies that asked for these grants and were given them by the city and buried their communities there. And that goes from the French, Italian, German, Scandinavian, vast Chinese sections, Japanese, African-American Masons, veterans of the Civil War. There's a whole bunch of people. Basically, everybody who you might imagine representing the diversity of the city is in City Cemetery.
So Beth, what happened when San Francisco decided, all right, no more cemeteries within the city limits, we're moving everyone to Colma, and someone's remains, I mean, thousands of remains are in the city cemetery. Some were moved. How did some people get moved and other people get left behind, remains wise?
Well, there's sort of two categories of people who got moved. One of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is that this was a significant cemetery for the Chinese community in San Francisco. However, they had burial practices which often involved burying somebody in local ground for a few years and then taking care of their bones and sending them back to China, whether to their hometown or relatives or somewhere else. So a number of people left City Cemetery that way. The rest, and I don't believe there were very many that were moved. Woody might remember the number off the top of his head, but the city reached out to family that they could find and say, we're moving the cemetery. If you have someone buried here, please come and handle the relocation, the digging up, the moving, the reinterment. But because this was a place where poor and immigrant people were often laid to rest, they didn't have anybody local who could take care of that for them.
Or presumably the resources to, buy a big plot in Colma.
And
all
that
right,
was true. That was true in the other cemeteries as well, but private cemeteries, their relatives often had more means, so more people were moved, or most of the people were moved. But even in the nice, richer cemeteries, we still occasionally find people during excavation work in the city.
I do want to share some photos that we used in the article, and then some. I want to give a shout out to the San Francisco Historical Society, whom I love. As we grabbed some from, we're gonna talk about the update to the ceremony, and they posted some images to Instagram. So, Woody, can you tell us, I mean, what we're looking at here? This is obviously the Legion of Honor doing some either construction work or excavation work, and they're literally finding coffins.
Yeah, this was the section that we talked about, was the county dead, right? The indigent poor. And in the 1993 and 94, the Legion of Honor went through a major renovation and seismic work. And they expected to find bodies, but they were, I think, surprised and shocked at finding 1,500, the remains of 1,500 people at least. And that they eventually stopped. They were digging and finding things, and they eventually just called a halt to trying to enumerate what they were finding and who they were finding. About half of those people were put in a mass grave in Colma. It's still today, I often think of these treasures of art and paintings and sculpture, and that they rest on the bones of these poor men and women who are still under there. So
it's kind of an extraordinary notion to think of that, though. I mean, in addition to these human remains being there, and as you said, there of people who helped put their blood, sweat, and oftentimes gave their lives, or certainly their emotional health, or whatever, physical health, to San Francisco, are beneath not only the treasures at the Legion of Honor, but of the city's only public golf course, I believe. You can see here in the distance one of the few representations that you're actually standing on a ceremony. Beth, can you tell us what we're looking at here behind this dude golfing?
Yeah, this is it has several names, but it's the Kong Chau Funerary Monument, and it was a central piece of the Chinese section of City Cemetery. And today people are starting to come back to it. I understand that now people are keeping flowers and a broom to perform sort of ancestor reverence, grave sweeping type, not formal ceremonies necessarily, but just some way of honoring the dead that are still there.
And this, I mean, do golfers, and again, we're going to get to kind of there has been landmark status awarded to the cemetery, but do golfers, I mean, did you get a sense, not being a golfer myself, that those who use this golf course, and certainly as someone who has visited the Legion of Honor, I had no idea, are people being made aware in any way of that they're walking on hallowed ground other than this memorial?
The one golfer I spoke to at length is Richard Harris, who's the head of the San Francisco Public Golf Alliance, who has been playing there since he was a teenager. And he said, there's really no way not to know that these are cemetery structures. But, I've talked to other people who just never really realized that that's what these were. So it just really depends on who you're talking to. But separate from the landmarking, there is now a new interpretive panel on the site that says this used to be a former cemetery. Here's a map of the cemetery. Here are the monuments that are still here. So people who didn't know about it before, will have a chance to learn more.
And so Woody, why don't you tell us what happened? What did the San Francisco Board of Supervisors decide to do?
Yeah, this all came from some great researchers, Carrie Hervey-Lentz and John Martini and Alex Ryder and myself. And there was work being done on this roadway, which is El Camino del Mar. And out of that, there was some thought that some money could be found for an interpretive sign finally, because you can read about anything you want at Legion of Honor. You can read about the Transcontinental Highway. You can read about the Holocaust. You can read about all sorts of things, but there was no reference to city cemetery at all in any signage until this. So the money was found and this sign was unveiled just a week or so ago, the day after a landmark ordinance was signed by the mayor, making City Cemetery a city landmark and the first archaeological landmark in San Francisco.
What does that
Um,
mean specifically?
yeah, it's funny. People get a little confused about what a landmark means. They often think it just means a building, but you can recognize a site and you can recognize character defining features of that site. What makes this call to city cemetery for us? And like the Gong Chao funerary monument, there's another monument. The landscaping, some of the trees and the vegetation actually date from the city cemetery time. And it also sort of gives you some guidelines for when you might do maintenance work or some other kind of work that's going to affect the landscape, what information you might need to interpret and to treat it respectfully. So that's what kind of a landmark. It's also just a ceremonial gesture to like recognize it and give attention to this important place and its significance to the city.
Beth, does that mean that the golf course could be prohibited from updating their grounds in the future? Does the landmark status start to make things complicated if either the Legion of Honor or the golf course want to expand, dig in the dirt, plant a new tree, anything like that?
My understanding is that it doesn't threaten the golf course. Now, golfers there, it's a city-run facility. Golfers there have complained that it needs maintenance. It needs, upkeep on the grass, upkeep on the buildings that they use. And they were very worried that landmarking this space would sort of leave it frozen in time. But my understanding is that nobody in the city is interested in interfering with the golf course or letting it fall into ruin. But it does create additional protections for what is underneath the surface and what happens when any kind of digging work is done and you find somebody.
Carrie Hervey Lentz just put a really great fact sheet. I just checked it out. It's looks great. So I encourage for more information on kind of the nitty-gritty policy details on the city cemetery landmarking. Check that out. Before I dive into audience questions, I have one kind of larger one for both you, Beth, and Woody. It's an interesting point that you make in your article, Beth, that where do we and in fact the former mayor of San Francisco 100 years ago kind of asked the same question. It's very important to honor our dead, particularly these people who were underserved, did not receive the recognition as the great founders of San Francisco theoretically did. But there's also a housing crisis in San Francisco. There's a crisis of open space. Where is there a way to properly acknowledge our dead without giving up this kind of admittedly beautiful and sacred for a number of reasons part of San Francisco space?
I don't know if, famous last words, I don't know if I could ever predict that we would build housing on the city cemetery property. But there are a number of other places in San Francisco where housing is already on top of the graves of the dead that were here in the first 50 years. The whole Lone Mountain area is built up with residential, and plenty of times in the past 100 years, somebody's been gardening or digging a new foundation and they find somebody. Just a few years ago, the remains of a 2-year-old were found under a home that originally belonged to a family plot in Oddfellow Cemetery. But I don't know. It's a big question. Do you build housing on top of a place where there are 20,000 graves? Like, where is there tolerance for that? And if not, do you dig them all up? And if you dig them all up, what does that do? So
you mean what does that do in terms of the reverence to their remains?
Say that again.
Do you mean, what does that do in terms of kind of being reverent with their
Yeah.
remains? What do
You
you
know,
think? Oh, sorry.
remains were found during the renovations that transformed the main library into the Asian Art Museum. And at the time, they had a number of ceremonies to honor the dead that are still in the ground around that area, because leaders were worried that people would not come to the Asian Art Museum if they knew the dead were still there.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
What do you thoughts?
Well, we Americans, we're generally very casual about the deceased and the past. In general, we want to move on and go forward, attend to the exigencies of the moment, and we really don't honor and respect our dead, I think, as much as we should. And definitely, it's not hard to see in San Francisco how the needs of the living, were always deemed to be more important. In this case, in city cemeteries, particularly, is it better that they're still there and they were ignored and a golf course went over them, or that they were pulled out of the ground and put in these large graves in Colma? Might be a tie. I kind of feel like we should at least honor the people that are there now. And like I said, the Chinese American community has really stepped up and have taken ownership of that space again to honor their ancestors. And I hope other communities that are descendant communities of these different societies follow that example, and also have like annual things at Lincoln Park where we remember our ancestors and the people who came and were San Franciscans before us.
Woody, do you know if there are known burial grounds for long before the early Western settlers in San Francisco, of the indigenous people who are native to the area? Are there known specific burial grounds in the city of San Francisco as we know it now?
Yeah, Native American remains are definitely found and are definitely identified in the city. We try not to publicize where they are and when they happen. But there are contingencies. There's a process in place that the city undertakes when something like that is a possibility. But for sure, people have died here as long as there's been people here.
Sure. Why would you not publicize when remains are found?
Well, it's a sense of respect, and there's another thing about, like you showed the great pictures by Richard Barnes. The planning department wouldn't show those pictures in a display or in a PowerPoint, because that's an actual person, that skeleton that Richard took a picture of. And they're very sensitive, and a lot of people would be, about showing the dead, because they're still, they were somebody at some point, with people in a community that were attached to them. So again, it's a different attitude, right? I think there's a lot of people who I think, and we're doing this in October, who think Halloween and haunted houses and kind of have a little fun with it. But it is something that's a serious topic for a lot of other people, and has a lot of respect behind it.
Sure. Let's see, we're getting some, if you're ready for some questions. Do you remember, I guess this is a question for Woody, do you know the max capacity of that first cemetery at the Civic Center, what is now San Francisco Civic Center?
What the capacity was, or how many were put in there? They basically tried to build a city hall. It took 30 years to build it on the site after they closed that cemetery. And every part of construction, they found new bodies. And it was more than 30,000, I would say, that were easily put in that 13 acres.
Wow.
And if I can add something, that included 800 or more dead from a plot in North Beach, roughly where the St. Peter's and Paul Church is today, that was completely dug up and then moved into a group grave at Yerba Buena. They were among the first buried there.
Christy asks, if we suppose that there will be a finite amount of people, then we could design the landscape appropriately. So why not see these cemeteries as a blessing and a grace to the living? I mean, I think that gets back to the question of whose comfort, happiness, health do we prioritize? I realize that these are like complicated questions. We are talking about dead people who not only cannot speak for themselves, but we all have kind of different feelings around the dead. When someone if there is work being done, say at the Legion of Honor now, I know, Beth, you mentioned that historians or you were able to try and kind of figure out. There was one skeleton in particular that was in the French section of the cemetery that had a bullet hole in his head. And there are articles talking about a Frenchman who had shot himself. Are there people actively researching and trying little by little to identify those in City Cemetery?
There are a couple of researchers mentioned already, John Martini, Alex Ryder, who were able to cobble together a map of the various plots within City Cemetery, because there were a bunch for different Chinese benevolent associations, and then again other organizations that buried the dead. So you can at least narrow down if you find somebody, like where they might have belonged to originally. But DNA analysis is not really done when people make finds. So you're not necessarily looking at who they are genetically and whether they're related to anybody that you can track down. I think for the most part, it's not possible to tell who these people were unless you have something unusual like the French doctor who shot himself.
Woody, are any I mean, I guess autopsy is the wrong word, but and this is a morbid question, but is anyone when a body is found, is anyone examining it to make sure that it is indeed 100-year-old body as opposed to something more recent?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an environmental planning staff, I believe, as part of the planning department, and they have archaeologists on staff, and they bring in experts, especially around the idea of is it indigenous? Are they native peoples? Because that would, anybody they find, there might be a different sort of respectful treatment of those remains that they want to be aware of and cognizant of and follow. And also find the descendant communities that would be responsible for the reinterment of these remains. So yeah, they definitely do whatever research they can to figure that out.
John points out in the comments. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Beth.
I was just going to read John's comment.
Right.
John Martini, one of the historians who's worked extensively on City Cemetery, he points out that identifying individuals buried in the cemetery is difficult due to lack of records. A lot of formal records were lost in the 1906 earthquake.
Yeah, and the indigent dead, they were basically given a numbered wooden headboard. And then there was a large journal that essentially matched the names up with the numbers. And that's never been found. Newspaper reports say it was lost in the 1906 earthquake and fire.
Wow. Someone asked, I saw it up here earlier. Yes, Sharon, we will absolutely include links. Our wonderful, my coworker, Jessica Blau, is taking copious notes. We're going to send you links to all of this. Are there volunteer opportunities if anyone wants to get involved in helping to work to preserve City Cemetery, to help connect? Are there any volunteer opportunities available around this?
It's interesting because we have to identify the group, really, I guess, as to who that person would help with. I think the big thing the landmarking did, which was a great step forward, was it really united the fine arts museums with Legion of Honor runs. It is run by the Rec and Park Department, planning, and these different communities around, the golfers as well, around the idea that City Cemetery needs to be celebrated and it needs to be recognized. So we might have some volunteer opportunities soon. Now that everybody's sort of on board to recognize and celebrate its existence and to honor it. So.
This is incredible. Obviously, this topic is fascinating to so many of us, not just in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I'm sure this is, and San Francisco has such an eclectic and I find something particularly rich about San Francisco's history, but I'm sure that this must be the case in other big and burgeoning American cities, particularly in the West. So I hope we can revisit this conversation later, especially as more happens or is acknowledged over at the City Cemetery. I am so grateful to Beth Winegarner and Woody LaBounty for joining us today. Woody, wait, tell us where that walk is on October 22nd. How do we sign up if we want to take your walk?
Here, let's see, I can put it in the chat real quick.
It's in the Lone Mountain.
Yeah, anyway, I want to do it around Lone Mountain on Saturday morning, October 22nd. There's only like 16 spots left, but go to sanfranciscostoried.com. You can sign up there. And I'll send the link in the email that you guys are sending out. So
Awesome. And please join us next week. Before you go, please, I'd like to invite you all to join us next week. I'm so excited to welcome artist and author George McCalman. He will be discussing his new book, Illustrated Black History, in conversation with Alta contributor Rachel Levin. Oh, there's a link to Woody's event, an Evite sign up in the chat. So again, everyone, this has been recorded. I am so grateful to everyone for coming out. Again, Woody and Beth, you guys are fascinating. And thank you so much for
great article. Great
tracking
article.
our history.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, you guys are great.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Bye.